Okay, the way ours is set up is we have two power supplies. One power supply runs the TinyG board, and that happens to be a 24-volt power supply, and one power supply runs the Spindle. Okay, we're using PWM motor controller on the Spindle. I'll talk about that in a minute, but let's talk about where the power goes for the TinyG board, which is right here on the end. This plug right here, it's good for up to 30 volts, and it's clearly marked power and ground from the top. So we're going to have our red wire on the power and the ground on the other side, and then the board's powered. So now we've talked about the stepper motors and we've talked about the power. Let's go ahead and talk about our spindle controller. Okay, so here's our spindle controller, and it can be run in two ways. One way, you don't need to use anything off of the TinyG to control the speed. What you're going to do is use this jumper. You move the jumper over to this pin, and you can use this potentiometer, and you can turn it off or turn it all the way on. The connections are pretty simple. This right here is going to be your 48 volt in. The two leads closest to the potentiometer, okay, and it's going to be ground and positive, just like that. Okay, if you just take a look at things, caps at the top, and it's labeled right here, AC DC in. Don't run AC in, use your power supply. We have two power supplies, again, a 48 volt running the spindle and a 24 volt running the TinyG, and this is where the power connection comes in. This connection right here, this one runs out, it says load, and that's the load created by the motor. So this just runs out to your motor. Again, it's ground and positive. These two over here, since we're running PWM control, those two run over to the TinyG board. And I'll show you those connections, but it's pretty simple. It says PWM control and ground right on those back rails. That's it. You put the jumper to the far side, exposing the one pin on the left there, and you're set up for PWM control, which is pulse width modulation. Basically, you're going to send code either by manually inputting it, or you can program it into your G code when you make your files to turn your spindle on, run at this speed, and then turn it off. Okay, so that's pretty simple. That's the PWM controller. Let's show you where it hooks up. Alright, let's go over the PWM connections on the TinyG. There's two banks. You can see where it's divided. There's like 6 connections in the first bank, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 in the second bank of connections. This isn't the Molex connection, this is the screw connections, but it's pretty easily seen on the side. It's silk screened which each one of these pins are. So you find the PWM connection, which is this one right here, the second one in, and that's going to be the signal wire, or the positive, going back to the controller, and then the ground is going to be the end pin. Okay, and it's pretty clear. Remember that you share a ground, so if you hook any of these other connections up and you need a ground for it, you share it here. Now down here we're going to have limit switches. Our machine has X, Y, and Z homing switches. I call them limit switches because they can be a limit switch, they can be a homing switch, they can be a limit and a homing switch, or they could be off. Okay, they could also be on the min side or the max side. So the min side would be the 0 end of travel, and the max side would be on the opposite of 0. So you can set it up however you want. This board is really flexible. But we have our X set up in the minimum, and that's in this one right here. It's the third one in from this side, and then our ground is over here. Again, there's 2 grounds on this second bank, and then we have our next set, which is our Y. Okay, our Y min is right here. Okay, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 5th pin in. You skip one, and that's going to be your ground. In the Z, we're in the max, which is the 3rd one from this side over. Okay, and then it shares ground. So those are the connections for the limit switches. I'll show you how to configure them, and I'll show you what the machine does in this configuration. The Z is kind of tricky because homing basically will get the tool out of the way. It lifts the Z up first so you don't drag your tool through your material when it's done cutting, or you push home. So it does it in order. Z first, and then it goes X, and then it goes Y. Okay, so it goes in that order. And since 0 and home are 2 different places on the Z axis, it can be kind of a challenge. Okay, and we'll talk about soft limits and limit switches here in just a moment, but for right now, those are the connections, and I just want to identify them. So basically, we've talked about all the connections on the TinyG. This is your USB connection right here, and let's move on to some configuration setup. Actually, I'm going to show you the power supply setup, how that works now, and we'll go from that point into configuration. Okay, so when you set up your power supplies, make sure you look at them real close and define which one's which. Especially if you buy this kit, you're going to see that you have one that's dash 24 and one that's dash 48. This is a 48 volt, this is a 24 volt. Okay. Now on the side of these things, it's real important to note, it's set up for 115 volts or 230. Make sure they're in the 115. It's a little slider, because if you don't, you're going to damage everything. Okay, so get them in 115 if you're in the USA. If you live somewhere else, get a meter out, put it in your wall, find out what's going on with your voltage, and set it to the right one. All right. So you're going to run two power plugs. If you look back here, you'll see on that power strip, there's two plugs plugged in, one for each supply, and then we use the power strip to turn on and off both of them. Okay. You could parallel these up and run one plug back, but it's just not worth it. If one fails and causes a problem, it could damage the other one. All right. So your plugs, okay, they're going to have a green wire, a white wire, and a black wire. Okay. Now, the green wire is your ground, the white goes to N, and the black goes to L, or line. And then the same thing, green to ground, white to neutral, and L to line. All right. Now right here, there's pairs. So you have positive voltage and your negative voltage here, and there's three of them. So you got positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative in pairs. Okay. You can grab any ground you want to any positive. I just do it in pairs because it's easy to identify. All right. So on the 24 volt, this goes out to the TinyG board, to that front connection on the side where the servos are. Pretty simple. Positive goes to positive and negative goes to negative. And then on the 48 volt, this is our input for the spindle controller. This is the 48 volt in that I showed you on that PWM controller. And that's pretty simple. Again, we're in pairs. So the positive leads on these three. So I grab this positive, and then the negative is those three, and I grab that negative. So again, it's pair, pair, pair. That's it. That's your power supplies. Now we've talked about how to set everything up. I didn't talk about mounting any of the hardware and all that kind of stuff. That's pretty well documented. It's the electronics and how to configure everything that's not been talked about. All right, so let's go into the configuration and show you how all that works.